December 28, 2016, Albuquerque, New Mexico. A father found dead in his own garage, throat cut. No forced entry, the killer cleaned everything with bleach. And you'll know exactly how investigators caught a killer who thought he'd erased every trace, using the one piece of evidence he never knew existed. On the morning of December 29th, a woman named Valerie Torres settles down at her desk at a social services agency in Albuquerque. Her phone rings. On the other end is an 11-year-old girl named Sienna asking for her father. Don Fluitt, Sienna's dad, did not call her before bed last night. He always calls before bed. Valerie looks over at Don's desk. It is empty. She dials Don's cell phone. No answer. She sends a text. Half an hour passes. Nothing. Don Fluitt is a punctual man. He does not skip work without calling in. He does not ignore his phone. And he never, under any circumstances, forgets to say goodnight to his daughter. Valerie and a coworker drive to Don's townhouse on the west side of Albuquerque. The sky is dark and overcast. When they reach the front door, Valerie knocks. The door swings open on its own. They step inside and call Don's name. No answer. The living room is neat. A brand new bicycle sits under a Christmas tree, still wrapped in a bow. A cell phone is on the couch. A wallet is on the kitchen counter. Nothing appears to have been taken. Valerie heads to the two-car garage. She opens the door and flips the light. Don's truck is parked in its usual spot. But on the back wall, behind a neighbor's SUV, there is a streak of dark red. Valerie walks closer. She looks down into the space between the vehicle and the wall. Don Fluitt is lying on his back. His throat has been cut. A single wound running from one side of his neck to the other. There are smaller cuts near his eye, his ear. There are marks on his knuckles and scrapes on his hands. Burst capillaries in his eyes and eyelids, a sign of strangulation. Blunt force trauma to his head, as if he had been struck with something hard before the knife. Don Fluitt was 54 years old. He was a big man, strong, a former Bernalillo County firefighter. Whoever killed him did not do it easily. The wounds on his hands said he had fought back. Hard. Above the body, blood is spattered across the wall and the refrigerator and the side of Don's truck. But on the floor around him, there is almost nothing. Someone has mopped. On top of the washer nearby, an empty bottle of bleach. Inside the washer, piles of wet towels that still smell like chemicals. A crime scene tech sprays luminol through the house. It picks up traces of blood on the kitchen floor and in the sink. The killer had tried to clean the garage, washed their hands or the weapon in the kitchen, and left. They scrubbed everything they could reach. But blood is harder to erase than people think. Don Fluitt's golden retriever, Buddy, was found cowering in the bedroom when officers searched the house. The dog had pressed itself into the far corner of the room and would not come out. One of the responding officers noted it in his report. The dog appeared to have been frightened for some time, possibly since before the murder took place. It was a small detail, and at this point it did not tell investigators much. But it raised a question that would linger. If Don had only been home for a short time before he was killed, why had the dog already been terrified when Don walked through the door? Something, or someone, had been inside that house before Don Fluitt came home. Detective Matthew Kaplan arrives just before noon. He walks through the townhouse slowly. Neat, orderly, cookies on the counter that still look fresh. Nothing rifled through. No drawers hanging open. The wallet and phone untouched. This does not look like a robbery. The violence in the garage, the throat cut ear to ear, the strangulation, the blunt force, tells Kaplan this was personal. Someone wanted Don Fluitt dead, specifically and deliberately. The front door was open when Don's co-workers arrived, but there are no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house. That means the killer either had a key or they found another way in. Kaplan notes the door connecting the garage to the townhouse. If someone was already inside the garage when Don came home, they would not need to break in at all. Kaplan steps outside and speaks to the landlord, a man named Benny Ruiz, who has just pulled up in his car looking flustered. Benny says Don was a devoted father, a religious man, someone who opened his home to anyone. Nobody would want to hurt him. Then Benny pauses. He says Don did charity work feeding the homeless downtown. Maybe somebody from the street followed him home. Maybe it was a break-in. Kaplan files that away but does not believe it. The bleach, the mopping, the towels in the washer, that is not a random break-in. That is someone who planned to clean up after themselves. Someone who brought time and intention to this killing. Don Fluitt had spent the past 2 weeks in California with his daughter Sienna, visiting his mother for Christmas. His sister Janice had just died of breast cancer, one of the few close family members he had left. His father was already dead. His other sister was gone too. His younger brother Dennis had stopped speaking to him after an argument over their late father's possessions. Don had driven 12 hours straight to get home, dropped Sienna off at her mother's house around 7:45 that evening, and returned to his townhouse alone. Before we get to what investigators found next, if you're new here and you want more stories like this, hit subscribe, because what happened next turned this case in a direction nobody expected. Think about what Kaplan had at this point. A violent, personal killing. No forced entry, no robbery, a crime scene scrubbed with bleach. A victim who was strong enough to fight back, and clearly did. Someone who knew Don. Someone who knew he would be home alone that night. Someone who had time to clean up afterwards. The next day, December 30th, Kaplan gets a call from one of Don's neighbors. She tells him she has been going through her home security camera footage from the night of the murder. She has found something. Kaplan drives to her house. She sits him down at her computer and presses play. The black and white footage shows the side of Don's townhouse, shot from the top of the driveway next door. At 7:37 p.m., light spills onto the ground, the garage door opening. Don's truck pulls out and drives away. Don and Sienna heading to Christine's house. 4 minutes later, at 7:41 p.m., a hooded figure appears in the corner of the frame. The figure walks to the curb, tips over Don's trash can, and then moves up the driveway toward the garage. The figure disappears off screen. Minutes later, Don returns. The footage shows him parking in the garage, then walking back down the driveway to pick up the overturned trash can. He carries it upright, walks back up, and enters the house. The garage door begins to close. The light on the ground narrows. Then something strange happens. The light stops narrowing. It grows wider again. The door is going back up. 3 brief flashes of light. Then the light narrows again and disappears. The garage door closes. The driveway goes dark. The hooded figure is never seen leaving. Kaplan takes the footage back to Don's garage. He stands inside and presses the garage door button. The door descends. He walks underneath it. The sensor trips. The door stops, reverses, and a light on the motor flashes 3 times. 3 flashes. Exactly what he saw in the video. The killer had followed Don into the garage. When Don pressed the button to close the door, the killer tried to slip in and tripped the sensor. The door stopped, flashed, reversed. The killer rushed to the wall panel, hit the button again, and the door closed. Don, inside the townhouse by then, heard the door stop and roll back up. He paused. Then he heard it close again. He shook his head and kept unpacking. He never checked. The trash can was not an accident. Whoever did this knew Don well enough to know he would not leave a knocked-over trash can on his curb overnight. They knew he would walk down, fix it, and walk back, leaving the garage open and unattended long enough for someone to slip inside. They knew his schedule. They knew he was dropping Sienna off that evening and coming home alone. They knew he smoked cigarettes in the garage before bed. This was not a stranger. This was someone who had studied Don Fluitt's life. Kaplan went back through the footage one more time. He watched the hooded figure move with purpose. No hesitation, no looking around, no wasted movement. The figure knew exactly where the trash can was, knew exactly which direction to walk, knew exactly how long they had before Don would return from Christine's house. This was not someone casing a house for the first time. This was someone who had been on this street before, probably many times, and who understood exactly how Don Fluitt's evenings worked. Kaplan paused the footage on the frame where the figure first appeared. A hoodie, average build, the face completely obscured. It could have been anyone, but the behavior told a story the image could not. This person had rehearsed. Kaplan begins working through the list. Don's ex-wife, Christine White, is ruled out first. Don dropped Sienna off at Christine's house at 7:45 p.m. Christine and Sienna spent the rest of the night together. Airtight. Christine mentions two things. First, Don used to have a problem with road rage. Maybe he got into it with another driver on the 12-hour trip home. Second, Don had told her his golden retriever, Buddy, was acting skittish when he arrived home, cowering in the bedroom, nervous, unlike himself. Kaplan notes both details. The road rage theory seems unlikely, but the dog acting scared before Don was killed, that is interesting. Something or someone had already been in that house. Next, Kaplan sits down with Christine's husband, Terry White. Terry is a truck driver. He is calm, polite, cooperative. He tells Kaplan his relationship with Don was not bad, just awkward. The custody battle between Don and Christine had made things tense. Terry says he tried to keep the peace by avoiding Don. He loved Sienna and did not want to be the reason for conflict. For the night of the murder, Terry says he was at his sister's house until about 9 p.m., then stopped at Wendy's, then drove to his trucking job and took a nap in his truck in the parking lot before his shift started. Kaplan calls Terry's sister. She confirms Terry was there until about 9 p.m. Terry White's alibi checks out. Don's adult children from his first marriage, Tiffany and Josh, who live in Oklahoma, point Kaplan in a different direction. They say the detective should be looking at Don's brother, Dennis. Don and Dennis had fallen out over their late father's possessions. Dennis had a criminal record, assault and disorderly conduct. And since Don's death, Dennis had obtained keys to the townhouse and had been inside boxing up Don's belongings and taking control of his affairs. He even asked the landlord about renting another property nearby so he could set up a new home for Sienna. Kaplan brings Dennis in. Dennis is keyed up in the interrogation room. Kaplan cannot tell if it is guilt or indignation. Dennis explains the feud with his brother. Their father had died in October 2015. The family agreed on how to divide his possessions, but Don kept one of their father's cars. The argument spiraled. They stopped speaking. Dennis says he tried to reconcile that fall, but Don never returned his calls. His only alibi is that he was home alone. Kaplan pressed harder. He asked Dennis why, after a full year of silence, he had suddenly become so involved in his brother's affairs. Dennis's jaw tightened. He said he had regrets. He said the argument over the car was stupid and that he wished he had tried harder to fix things before it was too late. He said when he got the call that Don was dead, the first thing he thought was that he would never get the chance to make it right. Kaplan studied Dennis's face. The emotion seemed genuine. But genuine emotion did not rule out guilt. People who kill family members often feel genuine grief afterward, and Dennis had a record. 2 prior charges, one for assault, one for disorderly conduct. He had a history of escalating when he felt wronged. The question was whether the argument over their father's car had escalated further than anyone knew. But there was nothing physical connecting Dennis to the crime scene. No DNA, no fingerprints, no trace evidence, just motive, proximity, and an empty alibi. Then Dennis offers something else. He says a few days after the murder, he walked into Don's townhouse and found the landlord, Benny Ruiz, standing inside with no explanation. Dennis thinks that is suspicious. He also mentions that Don and Benny had been arguing for months over a hole in the ceiling that Benny refused to fix. Kaplan remembers Benny, the man who showed up on day 1 and immediately suggested a homeless person might have broken in. Quick to offer a theory, quick to deflect. Kaplan brings Benny in. Benny says he was only in Don's house to feed the dog. Nobody else was taking care of it. And if anyone is suspicious, Benny says, it is Dennis. Dennis showed up out of nowhere after a year of not speaking to his brother, took the keys and started going through Don's things. Benny ran a background check on Dennis and found the assault record. He told Dennis no when Dennis asked to rent the other property. Kaplan sat with that for a moment. Benny Ruiz had been the first person on the scene after police, showing up uninvited, looking flustered, immediately offering a theory about a homeless intruder. Now he was pointing the finger at Dennis, and Dennis was pointing the finger right back at him. The truth was, Benny had his own reasons to be uncomfortable. He owned the townhouse. He had a key. He had been in a running dispute with Don over a ceiling repair that had dragged on for months. Don had called him repeatedly about it, and Benny had done nothing. It was a small conflict, but Kaplan had seen smaller ones turn into motives, and Benny had no alibi for the night Don was killed. He said he was at home. No one could confirm it. Still, like Dennis, there was nothing physical tying Benny to the murder. No DNA, no prints, no evidence that he had ever been inside that garage on the night in question. Just suspicion. And suspicion was not enough. Dennis points at Benny. Benny points at Dennis. Neither has a solid alibi. Neither has evidence linking them to the murder, and neither has evidence clearing them. Weeks pass. The investigation stalls. In February, the local newspaper runs a front-page story saying the police have no suspects and no evidence. Kaplan reads it. He has to admit it is more or less true. For nearly 2 months, the case sat in a kind of limbo. Kaplan had 3 persons of interest: a brother with a grudge, a landlord with a key, and a stepfather with a checked alibi. None of them could be charged. None of them could be cleared. The portrait of Don Fluitt as a man without enemies held firm. His co-workers described him as generous and reliable. His friends from church said he had turned his life around completely. The volunteers who helped with Spaghetti Sunday said he was the kind of person who would give you the shirt off his back. Kaplan kept coming back to the same thought. Don Fluitt had fought hard in that garage. He was a big man, strong, trained as a firefighter. The wounds on his hands were not passive. They were the wounds of a man throwing punches, grabbing, clawing. If Don had made contact with his attacker's skin, and given the ferocity of the struggle, it seemed almost certain that he had, then the evidence might not be on the floor or the walls or the truck. It might be somewhere the bleach could never reach. He was waiting on the lab. The lab was taking its time. But there is one thread Kaplan has not finished pulling. He goes back to the surveillance footage from Terry White's trucking job. Terry said he arrived at the parking lot, napped in his truck, then went inside for his shift. The footage shows something different. Terry did not nap in the parking lot. He drove past the lot, parked in a dark area around the corner, then came back and entered the building. His story does not match. Kaplan confronts Terry. Terry's story changes. He says he did not park in the lot right away. He went around the corner first, fell asleep there, then moved to the lot. And he adds a new detail he had not mentioned before. He stopped at Walmart on the way to work and bought a new sweatshirt. He told investigators he had nothing to hide. His alibi had just changed twice, and he had bought a new shirt in the middle of the night on his way to work. The same night his wife's ex-husband was found with his throat cut in a garage, scrubbed with bleach. 12 weeks after Don Fluitt's murder, the crime lab called Detective Kaplan. They had processed the material collected from under Don Fluitt's fingernails, the hands that had fought back, the hands with defensive wounds that Kaplan had noted on the very first day. The DNA belonged to Terry White. Don Fluitt had not been able to save his own life. But in the last minutes of it, fighting in that garage against the man who would kill him, he had clawed at his attacker's face hard enough to trap biological evidence under his nails. Evidence that no amount of bleach could reach. Evidence that Terry White did not even know he had left behind. The man who killed Don Fluitt was the same man who tucked Don's daughter into bed at night. Based on DNA evidence, the security footage, and testimony that would later emerge, This is what investigators believe happened on the evening of December 28, 2016. Terry White had been watching. He knew Don's schedule, when he left, when he returned, when he would be alone. He knew Don and Sienna were due back from California that evening. He knew Don would drop Sienna off at Christine's house and come home by himself. He knew Don smoked in the garage before bed. And he knew that Don Fluitt was the kind of man who would not leave a trash can lying on its side overnight. Sometime before 7:40 p.m., Terry positioned himself outside Don's townhouse. When Don's garage door opened and the truck pulled away, Terry moved fast. He tipped the trash can onto its side and retreated to the shadows. In his hand, he carried a tire thumper, a short wooden bat that truckers use to check tire pressure. Don returned. He saw the trash can. He parked in the garage, walked down the driveway, set the can upright, and walked back up. He pressed the button to close the garage door and stepped inside his townhouse. Terry slipped into the garage behind him. He tripped the sensor. The door stopped, flashed, reversed. Terry hit the wall panel. The door closed. Don paused inside the townhouse, heard the door settle, and decided he had imagined it. For a moment, Terry thought it was over before it started. The sensor had tripped. The light had flashed 3 times. The door had gone back up. If Don had walked out to check, Terry would have been standing in the middle of the garage with a tire thumper in his hand and nowhere to go. But Don did not come out. The door closed again. The garage went dark. And Terry pressed himself against the wall behind the SUV, controlling his breathing, listening to the sounds of Don moving around inside the townhouse, unpacking, putting things away, living the last ordinary minutes of his life. Terry could hear Don's footsteps through the door. He could hear cabinet doors opening and closing. He could hear the dog whimpering somewhere deeper in the house. He waited. He knew Don would come out to the garage eventually. Don always came out for a cigarette before bed. All Terry had to do was be patient. Terry waited in the dark behind a vehicle. Minutes passed. Then the doorknob to the townhouse turned. Don stepped into the garage. Terry struck him with the tire thumper so hard the wooden bat split into pieces. He hit Don again and again with his fists. Don fought back. He threw punches. He clawed at Terry's face. He did everything he could to survive. But the first blow had been devastating. When Don could no longer stand, he tried to crawl under his truck. Terry pulled him out. What happened next, the medical examiner would piece together later. The strangulation. Then a knife. A steak knife taken from Don's own kitchen, drawn across his throat. Terry found bleach. He found towels. He mopped the floor, wiped down surfaces, washed his hands in the kitchen sink. He loaded the towels into the washer. Then he drove to Walmart and bought a new sweatshirt to replace the one soaked in Don Fluitt's blood. He drove to work and clocked in for his shift. When a warrant was issued for Terry White's arrest on April 3, 2017, Christine White, Don's ex-wife and Terry's current wife, reported Terry missing. Detectives searched Christine's car and found something in the glove compartment: Terry White's last will and testament. Days later, deputies in Holbrook, Arizona, 200 miles from Albuquerque, found Terry inside his vehicle with a hose connected between the exhaust pipe and the cab. He was red-faced from carbon monoxide, drowsy, barely conscious. He was arrested on the spot. Inside the vehicle, deputies also found a note. Terry had written instructions for what should happen after his death. According to the cellmate who would later testify, Terry had attempted suicide 3 separate times in the weeks after the warrant was issued. The plan, according to the cellmate, was for Terry to die so that Christine could collect his $250,000 life insurance policy, money that would go toward raising Sienna. Christine, according to this account, was disappointed each time the attempts failed. Terry White had killed Don Fluitt so that Christine could have Sienna to herself. And when the law caught up to him, his final move was to try to die so that Christine could profit from his death. Every decision Terry White made circled back to the same thing: control over a child who was never his. In jail, Terry White was placed in a cell with a man named Roderick White, no relation. Terry talked. According to Roderick, Terry confessed in detail. He described the tire thumper splitting into 3 pieces. He described Don trying to crawl under the truck. He said he had a backup plan, an axe hanging on the garage wall, in case the thumper was not enough. He said Don had clawed at his face during the fight and that he knew the scratches might leave DNA, but he thought the bleach would take care of it. Roderick told detectives one more thing. Terry said he did it for Christine, that Christine had told him it was time, that Don was a black cloud hanging over their family, that the custody battle had gone on long enough, that this was the only way to make it stop. When asked why he killed Don Fluitt, Terry White reportedly told his cellmate, "The motherfucker just wouldn't go away." In August 2018, a jury found Terry White guilty of first-degree murder, aggravated burglary with a deadly weapon, and evidence tampering. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 12 years. The New Mexico Supreme Court upheld his conviction in December 2019. Christine White was arrested and charged with first-degree murder based on Roderick White's testimony that Terry had acted on her orders. But the charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence. Christine was never tried. Don Fluitt's mother, Sharon, told reporters after the trial that the real architect of her son's murder was still free. The puppeteer, she said, is still pulling the strings. At the time of his death, Don Fluitt had spent years rebuilding his life. He had lost his career as a firefighter after failing a drug test. He had lost his first marriage, and with it, daily access to his 2 oldest children. He had fought in court for shared custody of Sienna, and won. Every Sunday, he and Sienna would cook big batches of spaghetti and drive downtown to feed the homeless. They called it Spaghetti Sunday. What started as just the 2 of them grew into a real operation. Volunteers, donated clothes, canned goods. Don had built something meaningful. He had built it with his daughter. The night he was killed, Don had pulled into Christine's driveway 10 minutes late. Christine stood at the door with her arms crossed. Don apologized. Long drive, traffic, only a few stops. Before Sienna ran inside, Don pulled her in for a hug and promised to call before bed. He told her they would test ride the new bicycle that weekend. He never made that call. The bicycle stayed under the tree. Don Fluitt could not save his own life, but by fighting back in that garage, by refusing to stop even after the first blow shattered the weapon, even as he was dragged from underneath his own truck, he left behind the one thing his killer could not bleach away. And in doing that, he made sure the man who lived under the same roof as his daughter would never be near her again. The bicycle was still under the Christmas tree when investigators cleared the scene. Nobody had moved it. Nobody had ridden it. It sat there with its bow still on, waiting for a Sunday that never came. Terry White told his cellmate he scrubbed that garage clean. He bleached the floor. He washed the towels. He bought a new shirt. He went to work. He thought he had erased everything. What he didn't know was that the evidence that would end him wasn't on the floor, or the walls, or the truck. It was underneath the fingernails of a man who refused to stop fighting, even when it was already too late. Would you have looked twice at the man your daughter called stepdad? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you think the person closest to the victim is always the first suspect, there's another case where investigators missed the answer for over a year, even though it was right across the street. That one's right here.